Lake Mungo has not held a drop of water in over 10,000 years. But in 1968, wind across its driest dune exposed a bone fragment that forced scientists to more than double how old they thought Australia's human story was. One bone became footprints. Footprints became a DNA test that nearly rewrote where every human on Earth actually came from. Geologists confirmed it. Archaeologists confirmed it. Aboriginal elders had always known it. What happened next made headlines around the world, and part of it still hasn't been resolved. In July 1968, a young geology student named Jim Bowler was mapping the old lake beds of the Willandra system when he spotted something pale in the eroding face of a dune. Bone. Human bone. Fragmented. Scattered across a small patch of exposed clay. What Bowler had found became known as Mungo Lady. Her remains had been burned, her bones crushed and gathered into a small pit, and then covered over. It was, as far as anyone could tell, one of the oldest deliberate cremations ever documented anywhere on Earth. Not a body left where it fell. A funeral. At the time, the accepted timeline for human presence in Australia was short. Most researchers assume people had arrived from Asia perhaps 20,000 years earlier, if that. Mungo Lady's remains would eventually be dated to somewhere between 40,000 and 42,000 years old. That number didn't just push the timeline back, it nearly doubled it overnight. 6 years later, in February 1974, Bowler was back at the same lunette, 500 meters further along, when the sand gave up a second set of remains. This time, an almost complete skeleton. A man, roughly 170 centimeters tall, laid out on his back with his hands folded together at his lap, as though someone had arranged him with care. He had been dusted, deliberately, with red ochre. Not scattered by accident. Powdered and applied, likely carried from a source many kilometers away, because there is no natural ochre deposit anywhere near Lake Mungo itself. Someone had planned this. Someone had walked a long way to get the material for it. Analysis of the skeleton showed a man who had lived to around 50 years old. A genuinely old age for a hunter-gatherer in the late Pleistocene. His right elbow showed the kind of arthritic wear you'd expect from a lifetime of throwing a spear. His teeth were worn down, possibly from years of stripping plant fiber with his mouth to make twine. This was not a symbolic figure invented later by storytellers. This was a real aging man, given a real funeral, more than 40,000 years before the pyramids were built. Scientists began calling him Mungo Man. Along with Mungo Lady, his remains became, and still remain, the oldest anatomically modern human remains ever found on the Australian continent, and among the oldest found anywhere outside Africa. If the burials were the first shock, what happened in 2003 was the second. And this is the part that genuinely stunned trained trackers who'd spent careers reading footprints. An Aboriginal ranger named Mary Papin Jr., granddaughter of a local elder who had spent decades fighting for the return of ancestral remains, was walking the claypans near the lake when she noticed something in the hardened mud. A footprint, then another. Then, as archaeologists began carefully excavating the surrounding clay, hundreds more. By the time the site had been fully mapped, researchers had documented over 450 individual footprints, preserved in a mudflat that had dried under the sun around 20,000 years ago, and then been sealed beneath drifting sand ever since. It remains the largest collection of Ice Age human footprints ever found anywhere on the planet. What made the find extraordinary wasn't just the number, It was what the footprints could tell trained trackers about the exact moment they were made. Analysis showed the prints of 12 men, 4 women, and 7 children moving together across the flat. In one section, the spacing and depth of the prints changed. The stride lengthened, the pressure shifted forward onto the toes. A group of men had broken into a run. Experts estimated their speed at close to the pace of competitive long-distance runners today, moving barefoot across drying mud 20,000 years ago. To interpret the tracks properly, archaeologists brought in help that no laboratory could replicate. They invited a group of Pintubi trackers from Central Australia, people who had grown up reading country the way their own ancestors always had, largely untouched by European influence. One of those trackers had spent his childhood around a man in his own community who had lost the use of one leg and knew exactly how that changes the depth, spacing and drag of a footprint in soft ground. When his group reached one particular trail at Willandra, he recognized it immediately. In another set of prints, a single man's trail stood out. His steps showed an uneven gait, consistent with a man missing the use of one leg, hopping and dragging his way across the flat, evidently still keeping pace with the group. 20,000 years later, his footprints are still there, and so is the shape of whatever effort it took him to keep up. Read correctly, in the end, not by a machine, but by someone whose own life let him recognize it on sight. For most of the story so far, Lake Mungo's history is remarkable but settled. What happened next was not, and this is the part where science briefly lost its footing. In 2001, a research team led by paleoanthropologist Alan Thorne extracted a fragment of mitochondrial DNA from Mungo man's remains and published a finding that stunned the field. The extraction itself was done with unusual care for the time. The lead researcher tested his own DNA and Thorne's as controls, practiced on other ancient bones first, and drilled each sample from deep inside the bone, away from anywhere a human hand could have touched it. According to their analysis, this lineage appeared to have branched off before the common ancestor shared by every other human mitochondrial DNA sample ever studied, including from Neanderthals and from every other ancient and modern human population on record. If correct, that result would have been almost impossible to reconcile with the leading out-of-Africa model, in which every living person's maternal line traces back to a single population in Africa within roughly the last 200,000 years. A genuinely older, separately branching lineage sitting quietly in outback New South Wales would have meant one of two things. Either the out-of-Africa model needed serious revision, or multiple regional lineages had persisted far longer and far more independently than almost anyone in the field believed. The story made front pages across Australia. Photographs of Mungo man's skeleton, published alongside the DNA claim, spread further and faster than the nuance of the actual study ever could. And the sudden publicity is part of what pushed local Aboriginal communities to intensify their long-running campaign for his remains to finally be returned home. So which was it? Had science actually found a lineage older than everyone else on Earth, or was something much less dramatic going on? The scientific reaction was immediate and sharply divided. Other researchers pointed out that ancient DNA recovered from remains this old, handled and stored for decades before modern contamination controls existed, was extraordinarily vulnerable to picking up unrelated genetic material, from soil bacteria, from previous handling, even from the researchers themselves. It took 15 years, and the formal consent of the Willandra Lake's Aboriginal elders before anyone got a clear answer. A 2016 reanalysis went back to the same specimens with far more advanced techniques than existed in 2001, and found that the original Mungo man sample was contaminated with modern European DNA. But the same study also successfully extracted a genuine, previously unidentified ancient Aboriginal genetic lineage from a different Willandra skeleton entirely, confirming what oral tradition had insisted on all along: an unbroken ancestry stretching back tens of thousands of years, exactly where it had always been said to be. For the Pakanchi, Muthi Muthi, and Ngiampaa people, none of this science was ever the whole story. Their oral tradition had always held that their ancestors belonged to this land from the very beginning, not as recent arrivals from somewhere else, but as people who had always been here. For decades after their discovery, Mungo Lady and Mungo Man were kept far from Lake Mungo, first at the Australian National University, later shuffled between research institutions, while traditional owners campaigned for their return. Mungo Lady went home in 1992. Mungo Man was not repatriated until 2017, 43 years after he was first lifted from the dune, where he'd rested for over 40,000 years. In 2022, alongside more than 100 other ancestors recovered from the Willandra region over the decades, both were laid to rest again at Lake Mungo, in a ceremony led by the descendants of the very communities who had never stopped considering this their country. Lake Mungo doesn't need an unsolved crime or a vanished hiker to earn its place in this list. What it holds is stranger than that in its own way. The oldest deliberate human funeral ever found on this continent, a running family frozen mid-stride in mud for 20,000 years, and a DNA result that made front-page news claiming to have found something science had never seen before, only to be quietly overturned 15 years later by an even more advanced test on the very same bone. Most of that mystery has settled with time, but not all of it. Every few years, new dating work at Lake Mungo pushes the edges of the human timeline again. 40,000 years, then closer to 50, then further still, with no single number yet agreed on by everyone in the field,